Hey, good evening, everyone. And tonight we are starting with we are continuing rather with Elisha and his miracle working and his political impact. Just to remind you where we left off. So where we left Elisha, he was busy doing miracles with allowing people to kind of eat something that seemed poisoned from herbs, doing kind of fairly mundane things that were supporting the prophet community, right? And now, and what we saw was, so let's take a quick look at that and do just to remind us where we're at in the whole Elisha cycle, right? So just to remind you, Elisha, unlike Eliyahu, is very much a man of a certain portion of the people, at least, right? He helps the people from this prophet class that are apparently very fairly prevalent in northern Israel, and helps cities, also when they need it. And he's very involved with kings, right? If you'll recall, when he wants to help the Shunammite, he's like, "What do you need? Do I need to get kind of on the phone with the king?" Right, doesn't sound the phone, right? He says, "You need me to kind of step in for you with the king," or something like that. Like, wow, this guy's connected, right? He is connected. He's not simply an adversary. Now, also, just to remind you, part of this is that things have changed, right? There's a king in northern Israel. This is what we saw in our last class. There's a king in northern Israel who does worship the God of Israel, right? He's like, "No more Baal for me. I worship the God of Israel for all the good it does him," right? So things have changed. Things are not quite as adversarial as they were at the time of Eliyahu, but also the actual nature of the prophet is very different. Eliyahu was very much, it's not even it's my way or the highway, but very much me against the world, right? That worked well for him on Mount Carmel, on Har Carmel, when he kind of made sure that everyone realized, the Lord is God, etc. But it didn't work for the prophet that we need now. And so we had that revelation on Har Chorev for Eliyahu, where God tries to teach him something and it doesn't take, right? Eliyahu sticks to his guns and he's like, "Okay, Eliyahu, your time is gonna pass and you need to get your successor." And that's Elisha. And we've already seen how Elisha is much more connected to the people. He's much more on call for the king. He's very involved in what's going on, and he doesn't just leave things be. Okay, so let's dive back into the Elisha story. Sharing my screen as usual. Okay, so here we go. So this is where we left Elisha, just to remind you. So we're in Malachim Bet Parak Daled, that's 2 Kings chapter 4. And this is where we were last time, right? Where we had some smaller miracles, right? He brings a kid back to life. That's not a small miracle. And then you have a smaller miracle where he comes to Gilgal and he makes sure and he kind of makes this, they make a stew and they put in a bad herb and they're like, "Oh, there's death in this pot," and he essentially makes it edible, right? And then someone comes and brings food, which is not nearly enough for everyone. And thanks to Elisha, it is enough for everyone. So here are just a couple of small miracles that he does that allow this group of prophets to live. And now we're getting to our big famous miracle, and that is with Naaman. Naaman, why is this a big, important, famous miracle? It's a big, important, famous miracle because Naaman is not an Israelite, right? He is someone from outside. And what we're going to see is that the point of this story is not just to show the power of Elisha, but to show the power of God and the power of the God of Israel, that even people from outside of Israel should recognize, right, God's power. And they can recognize it through Elisha's miracle working. So let's take a look. So Naaman Sartzva Melech Aram. Naaman, the captain of the army of the king of Aram. Haya ish gadol lifnei adonav. He was a great man before his masters. Unasu panim kivon natan Hashem tishu al Aram. And he was very everyone. I think this translation is good. He was held in esteem because through him God gave salvation to Aram. So already we're kind of centering God in this whole story, right? Why is this guy successful? Because God gave him success, right? And this man he's a leper. Okay, what does this mean? He's a leper. He's got some kind of skin disease. Okay. Now, of course, skin diseases at this time, on the one hand, they're skin diseases, so you want to get rid of them, but also they are enough to, of course, as we know, get you kicked out of society. Now, again, we're not talking about today's leprosy. Whenever we talk about Sarat, we're generally not talking about what they call Hansen's disease, right? Which is today's leprosy. It's not the same thing. All right, it's some kind of skin disease. And this is, I always found this super sad. And they went and they had gone, they went out and they took captives in Israel. Why does it mean they went out in bands? It means there wasn't actually a whole war. This wasn't the result of a big war, but they were going out in kind of these scavenging bands, and they would take captives, and they took this little girl, and she was a servant to Naaman's wife. And she says to her mistress, Achale Adoni lifnei Navi asher b'Shomron, az yasofoto mitzarato. She says, if only my master would come before the prophet who's in Shomron, then he would get rid of his leprosy for him. And so people told Naaman, this is what this little girl from Eretz Yisrael, from the land of Israel, said. I always feel bad because this little girl, it was a captive. She stays a captive. Nothing ever happens to save her, and that always distressed me as a young person, and still today. Here's this little girl. She's captive in Aram, and she's helping everyone else, and nothing happens to save her. At least not in the story we have written before us. ויאמר מלך ארם לך בוא ושלחה ספר על מלך ישראל וילך ויקח בידו 10 כיכרי כסף ו6,000 זהב ו10 חליפות בגדים. So the king of Aram really likes this guy. He says, listen, I'm going to write a letter to the king of Israel so that you can go safely, right? And you can go and you can have it's almost you can see he's sending a lot of gifts with him, and essentially give this guy safe passage, right? He's coming to consult with your prophet. And the message comes to the king of Israel saying, we said the Sefer. So a Sefer, remember that a Sefer is really anything written. So in this case, it's a letter. It's not a book, right? And of course, as you remember, of course, there are no books until we get to the creation of codices, I should say. Everything's a scroll, everything's a letter. It could be on anything. It could be a piece of a piece of pottery. It doesn't matter. Okay, it's a written thing. This message comes, and he says, now when this message comes to you, I have sent you Naaman, my servant, so he should be recovered from his leprosy. Right? It said essentially, and you should recover from his leprosy. So the king of Israel sees this, and what's the first thing he thinks? He says, "Oh crap! This is some kind of trick, right? What the hell? I can't cure this guy of leprosy." Right? He left out an important thing, which is the prophet piece, right? So he says, "Vayomer ha'Elohim ani la'amitu la'achyot." Am I a god to kill and to make live? Ki zeh sholech elai la'asov ish mitzarato. That he's sending to me to cure this guy of his leprosy. He's looking for a reason to kind of attack me. The relations between Aram and Israel are not particularly good, and this will give him just the reason to kind of go out against me. But Elisha here, so remember that Elisha is kind of connected at this point to the court. Vayikishmo Elisha ish Elohim ki karam melech Yisrael gadav vayishlach el hamelech lemor lama karata b'gadecha yavona elai ve'eda ki yesh navi b'Yisrael. So Elisha hears, and he hears that the king of Israel is already like in mourning, and he says, "All right, why did you rip your clothing? Bring him to me, and he'll know that there is a prophet in Israel." And that is going to be the point of this story. So Elisha volunteers himself. Okay, and it's funny. What we have here is one of the examples of where it's supposed to be that Elisha has kind of inside knowledge, right? And because we didn't really have to have this, we could have just had him send a letter saying, "This is a letter for this guy to go to your prophet," right? But that's not what the letter says, even though that's what it should say. And Elisha has to hear about it. So he says, "Let him come to me." And in fact, Naaman comes to him with his horses and his carriage, and he stands at the door of the house of Elisha. Okay. And so Elisha sends a messenger to him saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will come back to you and you will be purified. Remember that the problem with Sarat, the skin disease, is not just the disease itself, but the fact that it's considered impure, right? So suffering from a disease like that is considered serious enough. Realize that this is the whole story assumes that this is a serious thing, right? That's why the king sends Naaman to another country that he's not in particularly good relations with for him to get cured, right? Because it's a serious thing beyond the actual disease. And Naaman got angry and he went away. He said, I said to myself, he's going to come out and he's going to stand and he's going to call in the name of the Lord his God, and he's going to wave his hand over the place and the leprosy is going to be gone. Right? I wanted him to do what he's supposed to do as like a prophet/magician. Let him call on his God and get rid of the leprosy. But he says to me to go and dip 7 times in the Jordan. What the heck, right? Halo tov amana ufarpar narot damesek mikol mimei Yisrael. Halo erchatz behem v'taharti vayifen vayelech b'cham Yisrael. We've got better rivers in Damascus, right? What's this Jordan? This little piddly Jordan. I've got better rivers in Damascus. I'll wash in them and become pure. And he went away in anger. Vayomru avi davar gadol hanavi diber alecha halo taseh v'af ki amar elecha rechatzu tahar. So his servants come to him with a classic kal v'chomer, and they say to him, "My father," right? They're speaking respectfully. They said, if he had said a hard thing for you to do, you would have done it. And all he said was, go and wash yourself and get purified. Okay. So that's what he does. He in fact goes and he dips in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God, Elisha, told him. And his flesh becomes like that of a young boy, and he is clean, he is pure, right? He is purified. Okay, so he comes back, right? So he comes back, the man of God, he with all his camp, and he comes and he stands before him. He says, now I know there's no God in the entire land, but only in Israel. Now please take a blessing, meaning a present, right, from your son. We know that he means a present from context. Okay. And he says, no, as God lives, I am not going to take a present, right? I'm not gonna be beholden to you. I'm not gonna be like I did this for some kind of profit. And he keeps on pressing him to take it, and he's like, no, okay, no, I'm not gonna take anything. So then Naaman says something interesting. Naaman says, Naaman, hello? Oh, he says, okay, if not, okay, I want you to give me enough earth that a pair of mules will carry it. They have that much earth. I'm not going to bring a sacrifice to other gods, only to God. So why does he need the earth? Why does he need the earth? Okay, he needs the earth because there's this idea, and this is interesting because you have this idea, certain things, this is universal and and a universal God. So the whole point of this is this guy from another nation's being cured, but that doesn't mean that God's not only in Israel. God's only in Israel. He knows the way he interprets it. Now the question is, are we supposed to be laughing at this guy or not laughing at this guy? Right? Are we supposed to be like, ha, 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 he didn't get it? Or are we supposed to be like, yeah, he's going to build, he wants to sacrifice to God. For that, he needs earth from the land of Israel. Because how can he sacrifice to the God of Israel not on the land of Israel? So he's taking earth with him back so he can still sacrifice, right? That's how he understands it. No one's correcting him, all right? No one's correcting him. So are we supposed to say he is being ridiculous, or we are supposed to go like, taka, right? Actually, who even thought? Like, here we are living in the land of Israel, and we're hearing this story about Elisha, and we're like, he's right. How is he going to sacrifice to God if he's not in the land of Israel? What's he supposed to do? Oh, he's taking earth. Is that going to work? It's an idea, right? Not our problem, right? Because we're in the land of Israel where we can sacrifice to God, right? It's his problem, and that's how he's solving it. Okay, now, of course, then he's going to go one step further. He's going to say, he's going to say, there's only one kind of cat. He says, for this thing may the Lord forgive your servant. He says, when my master, right, in other words, the king, goes to the house of Rimmon, a temple of another god, as it were, to worship there, and he leans on my arm. So when he bows, I have to bow. So please may God forgive me. And Elisha doesn't say you are being ridiculous, right? He says, "Vayomer lo lech l'shalom." He says, go in peace. Vayelech mito kivat aretz, and he went away from him a certain distance. Why a certain distance? Because we all know Elisha's servant Gehazi has other plans. Vayomer Gehazi nar Elisha ish Elohim. So Gehazi, who's the servant of Elisha, says, "Hine chasach Adoni Naaman harami hazeh mikachat miadoet asher hevi." Chai Hashem ki imratzti acharav lakachti mito muma. He says, look, Naaman saved this Aramean from taking the stuff that he brought. This guy brought all sorts of goodies with him, right, that we already read about. Why? And he's some Aramean, take it, right? He's missing the whole point. He's like, look, the guy's brought stuff, let's get his stuff. He's just an Aramean. Whereas the whole point for Elisha was, I'm making a point here. My point is that I'm not doing it for a reward. I'm doing it as a man of God. So Gehazi says, I'm going to run after him and I'm going to take something from him. But Yerdov Gehazi achrei Naaman, so Gehazi runs after Naaman. Vayireh Naaman ratz acharav, so Naaman sees him running after him. Vayipol me'al merkava lekvarto v'yomar shalom. So he drops off his carriage and he says to him, "Is everything well?" And he's like, "Yeah, everything's well. But my master sent me saying, now there are two young men from Har Ephraim, from the land or the mountains of Ephraim, from Mibnei HaNevi'im, from this prophet class. So please give them a talent of silver and 2 suits of clothes." And Naaman's like, "Sure, take them." All right, and he gives him more. He says, take 2 talents of silver. And so he urged him, and he gave him he this is he pushes him to take it the same way he pushed Elisha before, but Elisha said no. And he gives him 2 talents of silver, 2 kikarim of silver, and he gives him 2 suits of clothing, and he gives it to his 2 young men, to his 2 servants rather, and they carry it before him. And now, what seems to be happening here is it isn't what it sounds like is, so it's Naaman. You could read it 2 ways. You could say that Naaman sent his 2 servants, or that Gehazi took 2 guys with him as the excuse. Like, here, these guys are from the prophets, and you give it to them, right? But whatever, Gehazi takes the stuff at the end, and he kind of puts it up. He kind of locks it up in the house, and then he sends the people away, and he comes back, and Elisha's like, "Where are you coming from?" And he says, I've been around. I've been just walking around. He's a lousy liar. And Elisha says, you don't think loli bihalach kasher hafach ish me'amar kavto lekvartecha? Wasn't my heart with you when a man turned back from his chariot to meet you? Is this the time to take silver and to take clothes? And then he adds to it, and to take olive orchards, to take vineyards and sheep and cattle and slaves and maidservants? In other words, you are a greedy jerk. Right? You didn't just take a little bit of silver and a little bit. You're just showing that is this the time to take money? Is this the time for greed? The leprosy of Naaman should infect you and your children forever. And he went out after him from him. With leprosy that looked like snow, like his skin had turned white like snow. So that is the culmination of the story. Of course, Gehazi is going to come back later in our cycle, but the idea is, again, so there are a bunch of ideas here. First of all, the idea that of the prophet being a kind of not exactly like a light to the nations, in that he shows that the Lord God, like this, the God of Israel is the powerful God. He shows it to a major personage from an enemy, or at least an aggressive nation. And that there's this idea still that God of Israel is connected to Israel, is connected to the land of Israel, is connected to the people of Israel. And it's not so ridiculous, at least it's not spelled out for us, that Naaman taking a whole bunch of earth back with him is a ridiculous thing. Because he says specifically, I'm no longer going to sacrifice to those other gods. I'm only going to sacrifice to the God of Israel. So I need earth from the land of Israel. Okay.
Miriam, there's an interesting detail here that I didn't notice before when I read it. At the end, when Naaman gets healed, in a sub-sorok b'sar nar katon, like a flesh of a little boy, and then this little boy Gehazi, he's the one who gets leprosy. It's like a reversal.
It's true. You're right. It's a real reversal. Gehazi is called the Na'ar of Elisha. Even though I don't think Gehazi is supposed to be that young a boy, but you're absolutely right. I think that you're right, that it's meant to be this kind of reversal.
The same word, Na'ar.
Yeah.
Same word.
Na'ar, exactly. It's the same word. And I think you're right. Especially since, you normally wouldn't necessarily say nar katon, you might say a baby, and that's not the word it uses. It uses nar there and uses with Gehazi nar. So
it's on purpose, probably.
I think you're right. I think it's on purpose. I think that reversal, that switch between Naaman and Gehazi. Very good. Thank you. And I have a question. Do we have any evidence that leprosy is the same thing throughout the entire biblical period? I don't think that we have evidence. I think there is one specific disease that people tend to explain it as, but I don't think that we necessarily have proof because that it's the same skin disease, right? Because there's a general term, leprosy, right? So it's not clear, like, and there's a, other languages, cognate languages also refer to, skin diseases. So I don't think that it's necessarily all considered necessarily the same skin disease. We do have this kind of idea of it being white, right? Like looking white. So it's, but not so much like when Miriam has leprosy, Naaman has leprosy. So it seems to be this kind of white. When Moshe puts his hand and it gets leprosy, that seems to be this kind of white thing. But when we have the rules of leprosy in the Torah, that, then we have, is it yellow with a tinge of red? When I was in, I think it must have been like 7th, 8th grade, I think. Maybe even, I think something like 7th, 8th grade, we had to memorize. I remember I had to memorize the rules of leprosy. If it's this with a tinge of that, then they go back for 7 days. I had to memorize all those rules. Do I remember them? No. But it makes an impression. It makes an impression when you have to memorize it. So anyway, and my mother had to memorize biblical poetry, so she knows any biblical she starts quoting it to you. I had to memorize the rules of leprosy.
But Miriam, in these rules of Parashat Tazria, it does say that when it turns white, it means that he is a leopard. That's one of the signs. It turns white. Right. And for example, in Hansen's, it's the reverse. Like it turns black or dark.
Yeah, well, with Hansen's, it's a whole, like, I'm used to with modern lepers, one of the things, like, how they used to say, you'll have the whole thing of pieces falling off of them. And part of that is because they don't feel anything in their extremities. So when there's no nerve feelings, it's very easy to kind of lose parts of it. They had a situation where they had these kids with leprosy in like one of these leper orphanages or whatever, and the mice were eating them at night, like eating their fingers, and they didn't feel it, right? So like that's a whole other disease.
I'm just saying that the white fits. I'm just saying that the white fits all the descriptions.
Oh, you're right. Yeah. So you're right. So there is this kind of white, right? So, and then the question is it all the same thing? I do remember that I've seen it identified, like with the name, but I'm not sure it's everyone agrees that it's like the same thing across the board. Susan says, and it's a young girl who tells Naaman's wife about Elisha. Yes, the innocence and selflessness of the young girl contrast with Gehazi. Yes, especially the since they're both servants, right? So you have the servant girl who all she cares about, even though she's a slave from a different culture, is she cares about her master's welfare, and she doesn't ask for anything for herself in a situation where she really could. You could be like, oh, and maybe, like, return me to my people now that, like, you're cured. Like, there's nothing like that. And at the same time, Gehazi, despite the fact that his master has specifically doesn't want to take anything, Gehazi runs after to take something and kind of ruins the whole message. So I think that is also absolutely a contrast. Yeah. So back to Elisha. So after this, now we have another little miracle, right? So what's the little miracle here? I'm just going to summarize it. They go and they chop some wood, and the axe. So he goes with them. There's the group of prophets. He goes with them to the Jordan, and then they cut down some wood, and the axe head falls into the water, and they're like, "Oh no, it's a borrowed axe." I love this. Honestly, this is the best. It's like, it would have been okay, right? Because like, big deal, it's an axe. They're like, but it's borrowed. Time for a miracle, right? It's a borrowed axe. What are they going to do? Luckily enough, they have Elisha, and it's time for a miracle. Elisha, of course, makes it float. So he floats up the axe head, and they take it. So there's just another little vignette of him helping this group of prophets. Okay.
I guess the reason he borrowed it because he doesn't have money for his own, he's a wood chopper, he doesn't even have his own axe. So now they doesn't have.
They're prophets. They're a bunch of prophets.
Right. Like, sorry.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. They don't have anything.
Right.
So meanwhile, now the king of Aram is at war with Israel. Okay, so king of Aram is at war with Israel, and every time they're going to camp somewhere, in other words, there's somewhere they're going to attack, Elisha sends the king of Israel and says, this is where they're going to be. Okay, and again, we see how Elisha is being proactive and being connected to the king of Israel. Okay, even though we're not naming the king of Israel, so we don't know when this is, right? Because there are a few kings of Israel that Elisha kind of, because they serves under, quote unquote. And the king of Aram gets upset, and he's like, what's you? One of you guys? So he says to his men, he says, which one of you is ratting us out to the king of Israel? And so one of his servants says, no, he's got a prophet. Right? He says, Ki Elisha hanavi asher b'Yisrael yagid lemelech Yisrael et hadvarim asher tidaber b'chadar mishkavecha. So this also shows that the news of Elisha has gone far beyond the border, right? That the king's servants also know, and this is not necessarily connected to Naaman, right? The king's servants also know that they're like, Elisha knows what you say in your bedroom. Like, he knows everything. And he just tells the king. And so he says, okay, I'm going to go get him. He says, okay, go and find out where he is, and I'm going to send for him and take him. But you got They say, okay, he's in Dotan. So he sends horses and chariots, a lot of soldiers, and they come at night and they surround the city. And the servant, at this point, no longer Gehazi, one assumes, the servant of Ish Elohim, the man of God, and what it says, he gets up and he goes out and he looks and he sees that there's this army surrounding the city. So his servant says to Elisha, what are we going to do? And he says, don't be afraid, because there are more with us than there are with them. ויתפלל אלישע ויאמר, אדוני פקח נא את עיניו ויראה, ויפקח אדוני את עיני הנער וירא והנה ההר מלא סוסים ורכב אש סביבות אלישע. So Elisha says, God opened his eyes that he'll see, and he sees that the mountain's full of horses and chariots of fire. In other words, there's an angelic host ready to protect Elisha, which is tremendously impressive. Unfortunately, we don't get to see this angelic host go to war. Let's see what happens. It's
not just angelic horses. It's like, I'm sure it refers to Eliyahu, who went b'sara shamayim rechev esh.
It's a very clear, and if you remember, the whole point is that Elisha is supposed to have double Eliyahu's power, right? And this seems to point to that. Eliyahu went up on a single chariot of fire. Elisha is protected by a whole host of chariots of fire, right? So Elisha, this is showing Elisha's tremendous power. And then Elisha prays to God and says, smite them with blindness, and he smites them with blindness. And so he leads the army so they can't find themselves, they can't see anything. And Elisha says to them, to this army, he says, this is not the way, this isn't the right city, I'll lead you to the right place. And he leads them to Shomron. Now, Shomron is, of course, the capital, so there's plenty of armed soldiers, and so he's leading them into the lion's den. Okay, so he takes them to Shomron, and Elisha says, okay, now God, open their eyes and they'll see, and God opens their eyes and they see they're in Shomron. And the king of Israel says to Elisha, excuse me, he says, he says, shall I smite them, my father? Right. And again, he's calling Elisha is my father. Elisha called Eliyahu my father. Like the idea that there's respect there. Remember that, again, unlike Eliyahu, for most of Eliyahu's time, most of the time that Elisha is serving, he seems to have a relationship where the king of Israel either respects or fears him. I mean, we'll see. There's still a lot of tension there. So he says to Elisha, he says, should I smite them? And he says, no. He says, no. Asher shavita b'charbecha uvekashtecha tamake sim lechem v'mayim lifneihem v'yochlu v'yishtu v'yochlu el adoneihem. He says, oh, no, you shouldn't smite them. Did you take them captive with your sword and with your bow that you can smite them? Give them bread and water, let them go eat and drink and go to their masters. And that's what he did. He gives them food and they go home to their masters. Aram lavo be'eretz Israel, and the bands of Aram no longer continued to come in the land of Israel. So here, even though right afterwards we have Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, actually coming, right? So it's a very weird contrast here. Again, stories are not, it's hard to, this particular story, the one that we just read, we don't have the name of the king of Israel. So we don't know when this is happening. And then the next one is also going to be a little bit difficult to pin down in terms of time. All right. But right afterwards, we're going to have Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, and he is actually going to have a siege around Shomron. So in that case, there's mercy and there's tremendous mercy. And
Miriam?
Yes.
Is Ben-Hadad meant to be something like Paro? It's a generic name for Melech Aram?
Ben-Hadad is a name that repeats a lot. It's not meant to be Paro because it's not our generic name, but Ben-Hadad is a name that repeats. In Aram, it's a name that repeats. It's not supposed to be generic like Paro. In other words,
this is the name of a god. Hadad is the name of a god.
Yeah, but they also so it's meant to actually be their name. In other words, it's not meant to be like we say Paro Necho, right? So because Paro is what we come to call any king of Egypt. So not in that way, right?
Yeah, so it's not obviously it's not a title.
No, it's not a title.
It's a name.
Yeah. Again, unlike Paro, right? So Paro, which is never it was never actually a name of any pharaoh, right? So
even the name pharaoh means I think the house or the head of the house.
Yeah, it's like the palace. Yeah, it's
And
like saying the White House. It's like saying we hear from the White House, the blah 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 blah. It's like that.
Whereas Hadad is a name of a god, which means it's a private name.
Well, it's Ben-Hadad, so yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah. So it's but right. So it's his name. Or it's supposed to be at any rate.
So Hadad is the name of the god, and Ben-Hadad is just the son of the god, right?
It's supposed to be a name like it's like all most names are going to be theophoric. Like most names are going to have a name of a god in them in some way, not necessarily, I guess, but a lot of them do. And Ben-Hadad is a name which, if I remember correctly, is a name that in Aram they actually do frequently have a king with that name. In other words, they like giving that name to the king.
It's like Ben-Yahu.
It's like King George the III and the Fifth and the this and like why does it have to be George? Because it's George, right? Like we have in this period we have Yoram, the name Yoram repeating in Yehuda and in Israel, and we have a bunch of cases where we have these names that are the say Yoash, right? So we have certain names that seem to be, it's not quite the same way as they do in Aram. Like in Aram, the king is frequently named Ben-Hadad. Seems to be.
Is Ben-Hadad a name that appears in archaeological or?
I believe so, but I'll look it up. Okay. I believe so. If I remember correctly, yes, but I will look it up. Okay, so okay. So the king of Aram is fighting with Israel, and here we are. Okay, here we are. Ben-Hadad Melech Aram, he he gathers all his whole camp and he goes up and he puts a siege over Shomron. And there is a great famine in Shomron because they put a siege around us. They can't get in, they can't get out, they can't bring food in. So if there's such a famine that the head of a donkey costs 80 silver, the rova hakav chori or div yonim, it's chori. Div is to make it nicer language. Yonim v'chamisha kesef, and it's a quarter of a kav of dove's dung is sold for 5 pieces of silver. So there's 0 food, and people are eating impure food, right? People are eating impure food at tremendous cost because there is no more food. And here we have this classic story. The king of Israel is walking on the wall, walking by the wall, and a woman calls out to him and she says, please save me, my master, the king. Vayomer al Yoshiech Hashem me'ayin Yoshiech hamin hagoren min hayakavs. The king is out of he's kind of witty and sarcastic for a guy who's seeing everything crumble. He's like, if God doesn't help you, how am I going to help you? I'm going to help you from the threshing floor or from the wine press. You know, where's all this food that I'm going to help you with? Vayomer lahamelech malach. So he says, the king asked her, what's going on? What do you need? But Tomar Hisha hazot tamar. Now I'm going to remind you, as I always say, when you come to the king with a court case, you come to the king with a court case when you need special justice to be done. You need the king to look at the circumstances and be able to do justice in a case where normally you might not get justice. So this woman is doing just that. What was the deal? We all remember this one. She had a deal with another woman where the other woman said, let's split your son and eat him today, and we'll split my son and eat him tomorrow. And we cooked my son and ate him. And then on the next day, I said, okay, now bring your son and we'll eat him. And she hid her son. Okay. And she's coming to the king for justice. All right. And when the king heard the words of the woman, and he tears his clothing in mourning. Look at what we've come to, right? And he's going by the wall. And the people saw that he was in mourning. He ripped his clothing and he's wearing sackcloth under his clothing. He's the king. And he's in kind of this repentant mourning because of what's going on. Okay. He's doing from his point of view, all he can do, right? He put sackcloth on his flesh. He's tormenting himself because of what's going on. Because remember, he said, God didn't help you. God didn't help you. How can I help you? He's looking for help from God, and God's not paying attention, right? And he sees this, how horrible what these women actually think is normal behavior, that she can come to the king and he'll tell the other woman, now kill your son and split him and eat him. Like, he's like, oh my God, what has happened to us, right? And he rips his clothing and they all see that he's been wearing sackcloth, okay? And what is his utterance? What does he say? Who does he blame? He says, Vayomer ko yaseh li Elohim v'cho yosif im yamod rosh Elisha ben Shaphat alav hayom. He says, may God do this to me and continue if the head of Elisha ben Shaphat is still going to stand on him today. Elisha is dead, right? Elisha is dead. This is the lesson that he's coming out with, right? The lesson he's coming out with, Elisha the prophet, I blame him, right? He's the one who should have helped us in this situation, right? Probably he's expecting Elisha because Elisha should have called for mercy from God, right? And that's why he's blaming Elisha. He can't also he can't blame God, right? It's hard for him to blame God. So he can blame Elisha, right? As the person who's supposed to be the go-between. He's like, I'm going to kill that Elisha. That Elisha is dead. Okay. So it's not so easy to kill a prophet, not a true one, right? So what happens? So Elisha's there with the elders. He is respected. He's a respected prophet. He's a respected guy. והוא אמר אל הזקנים, הראיתם כי שלח בן המרצח הזה להסיר את ראשי. And he says, before the messenger gets to him, and this isn't clear that what it means that he sent a person before him. It seems to be out of place. It's hard to understand what that phrase is saying. But before the messenger comes to him, he says to the elders, he said, did you see that this son of a murderer sent people to remove my head? Said, when you see the messenger, close the door and hold it shut, because I can hear his master's footsteps coming behind him. Okay. And he's still speaking with them, and the messenger comes down to him. Okay. Vayomer. Now, this is, again, it looks like there are pieces out of place here. Okay. So what happens? He says, the messenger is going to come. He's going to come to kill me. Hold fast the door, because I can hear the king following him. The king's already regretting it. Right. So the king says, he says, this evil thing is from God. What more can I hope for from God? Right. And honestly, it's a cry of desperation, and it's a cry of, to be perfectly, like it's a cry of someone who's wearing sackcloth next to skin. Like, what else? This is from God. This is from God, that we are dying of hunger and that women are killing each other's children. What else? What can I possibly hope for? Right? He came out of anger. He wanted Elisha killed, and now he's recalling it out of despair. What's really going on is he's despairing. What can I do? What am I going to do? Okay, and I want you to know here that Elisha saw this coming, so he called him the son of a murderer, right? But he knows that he's going to regret it right away. He's like, he doesn't actually want me dead, right? He doesn't actually want me dead. He's running after the messenger right now. Okay, and in fact, he was. So what does Elisha say? He says, listen, so says God. So by this time tomorrow, a measure of flour is going to be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel in the gate of Shomron. In other words, that's where the market is, right in the city gates. ויען השליש אשר למלך נשען על ידו את איש אלוהים ויאמר הנה השם עושה ערובות בשמיים. היה הדבר הזה. So the captain, that the king is leaning on his arm, right? He says to Elisha, he says, is God going to make windows in heaven, right? ויאמר הנך רואה בעיניך ומשם לא תאכל. So Elisha answers him, you're going to see it and you're not going to get to eat from it. Now, arubot b'shamayim, actually, the idea of windows in heaven is something that we see a lot. I mean, this isn't the only reference to the idea of windows in heaven to be like to signify like storms or tremendous rains or something like that. Here, it seems to be saying that there are going to be windows in heaven that maybe the grain's going to fall through, even not just rain. The grain's going to fall through the windows in heaven. For those of you who are fans of ancient Near Eastern stuff, this is what Baal has to be reminded to make in his palace. Baal, if you remember, he's the storm god. So he needs windows in his palace for the rain to come out of. And there's a Ugaritic poem where he has to be reminded to create the windows. He's kind of a doofus, and he does this palace, and the craftsman is like, the craftsman's creating his palace for him, and he's like, aren't you going to want windows? And Baal's like, no, I'm fine. And then at the end, Israel's like, yeah, I'm going to need windows. windows. He's like, see, I told you. And about, it's like, you're like, ha, 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 ha. But it's that word is arubot, is the word for windows as well. So there's this idea, but here we're already pretty far beyond this idea of Baal. And it's just being used to say, kind of this miraculous opening of the heavens for plenty, right? So, so here we have the prophecy. The prophecy is this is going to end, and this is going to end tomorrow. And it seems to be a response to this heartfelt cry from the king, right? This recognition, this is all from God. What else can I hope for? And what's going to happen? And Elisha says, this is over tomorrow. And what happens? We all remember the story. You have the 4 lepers, and here we come back to leprosy. So there are 4 lepers who are standing at the entrance to the gate. Why? Because they're not allowed in the city, because they're lepers. And they're like, why are we sitting here? We're just going to die here. If we go into the city, we're going to die there from the hunger. And if we sit here, we'll die. So let's go and turn ourselves into the camp of the Arameans. If they let us live, we'll live. And if they kill us, we'll die. Otherwise, we're for sure going to die. So what does it matter? And this actually reflects their position as outsiders, right? Because why can't anyone do that? Because, well, everyone else can't do that because they're part of the city and they can't, and they're not allowed to leave. But these guys are already kind of out of the city. They're kind of outsiders already. They don't belong anywhere. So why not just turn themselves over to the camp of the Arameans? And they go to turn themselves into the camp of Arameans, and no one's there. Why? Because V'Adonai hishmi'a machane Aram kol rechev kol sus kol chayil gadol v'yomer ish el achiv hinei sachar alinu melech Yisrael et malchei achitim v'et malchei Mitzrayim leva elenu. What happened? God created this tremendous noise, and the whole camp said the king of Israel has hired the Hittite king and the Egyptian king against us. In other words, 2 fairly important kings to go against us. Even though the truth is, at this point, the Hittites are not such a big deal, but the Egyptians are a big deal. So they heard this tremendous amount of noise, and they got up and they ran away I thought it was dawn. This is translating twilight. But they ran away and they left their tents and their horses and their donkeys, the whole camp. They just ran to save their lives. And so these lepers come in and they're in the camp and they eat and they drink and they take silver and gold and clothing, and they go there and they bury it so they can come back to it later. They come to another tent and they take stuff from there and they go and they bury it. And then they actually look at each other and they say, each man says to his fellow, we're not doing the right thing. As a reminder, I've said this before, ken in biblical Hebrew does not mean yes. There is no real way to say just yes in biblical Hebrew, besides, let's say, repeating the words, like you say, did you eat? You say, I ate. Like that's a way of saying yes. Hineni, right? I'm here, right? You don't say yes. Ken in biblical Hebrew means ready to do something or here correct, right? We're not acting in a correct way. Hayom hazeh yom besorahu. Today is a day of glad tidings, of great tidings. V'anachnu machshim v'chikinu ad or haboker u'metza'anu avon. And we are delaying. If we wait till the morning light, we're gonna be found guilty. Found guilty. It honestly, here it says punishment will overtake us. I think u'metza'anu avon, the idea is that God's gonna see us and punish us. So now let's go and tell the king, tell the palace. Let's tell the palace. All right. Now, I do want to say that you could absolutely read it as, if we keep doing this, we're going to get in trouble, right? And so, so you could either say it as God's going to take it out on us, or the king's going to take it out on us. So let's go and tell the palace. And they go and they call the person who's the gatekeeper, and he tells them, and they tell him, we went to the camp of Arameans, there's no one there. And the horses are still tied up, the donkeys are still tied up, the tents are left as they are. And the gatekeepers call out, and they go into and they tell the inner palace, and the king gets up at night. Neshef is twilight, and the king gets up at night, and he says to his servants, he says, I know what's going on. The king says. The king didn't really believe Elisha either. Well, this is not too big a leap what the king's going to say. He says, Aram knows we're hungry. Okay, so they went out of their camp, they hid in the field, and now when we go out of the city, they're going to and so they went and saying they went to hide in the field and saying, when they come out of the city, we're going to catch them alive, and then we'll just come into the city. And so they said, okay, let's check it out. So the king says, okay, go and check it out. They go and they check it out. They keep walking until the Yarden, until the Jordan, and the whole place is just filled with abandoned clothes and vessels like stuff, like things they're worth money that the Arameans threw away when they were rushing, and the messengers came back and told the king. So the whole nation went out and they took spoils from the camp of Aram. And in fact, it was a measure of flour was for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, just as God said. And the king appointed his officer, that officer who doubted Elisha, on the gate, and everyone trampled him because they were all running to eat, not just to eat. One assumes mainly to eat, because that people just don't care then. So they trampled him and he died. So this is just like Kasher Diber Ish Elohim Asher Diber Bered HaMelech Elav, just as the man of God said when the king went down to him. But he could Diber Ish Elohim HaMelech Lemor that time. Okay, so he just repeats what he said, and yeah, it's just Shalish didn't believe it. And he said, here, you're going to see it with your eyes, and you're not going to eat it. So he saw it because he was at the gate, right? And he got trampled and he died. So everything came true, just like Elisha said. So I see that we're at the end of our time. I'm going to take some questions and we're going to sum this up. Ido says the stories are probably not in chronological order. That's what I said. Both of these stories are not in chronological order.
Just answer the question.
Oh, I see. So Susan says, okay, let me hold on just a second. So Susan said, how to explain the aggression of Aram right after the positive episode of Naaman? Right. So these stories are not in chronological order, and both of these stories are not chronological at all. In other words, both these 2 stories that we just read, the one with Naaman and the one with this siege, are not, we can't place them with a particular king of Israel, right? We can't place them in a particular time period. And in fact, there are, theories about when you could have had a siege like this of Shomron, or even of a nearby city. But it's hard to, but the stories themselves are absolutely not in a chronology. It's like this happened sometime. What?
It's a bit strange because all Melachim is very nicely edited. Chronological order, edited, you can see someone.
It's strange, and it seems to be two contrasting things, right? One where there are several contrasting things, okay? He helps Naaman. There's another story where there's this whole troop that he says, should I kill them? And he's like, no, don't kill them, right? And then right after that, we go right into a siege of Shomron, right? The story the previous story ended when he brought these soldiers to Shomron, where of course they were going to die, right? And then and it says, and after that, they never had Gedudim, like these bands of Arameans in Israel. The next story is about Arameans creating a siege on Israel, right? So it's a very weird juxtaposition. It's a very weird juxtaposition. Why and possibly the reason is to kind of remind us that Arameans are bad. Like, don't end saying that you should always be merciful to Arameans. Maybe that's why. Like, don't always be merciful to them because they also do bad stuff. I have to say that this story, and we're ending right. So I'm trying to think what would be the criterion for ordering these stories. There is a kind of a progression. On the one hand, there is a certain amount you can say, okay, there's a story of Naaman where he does a good thing for one important army officer of Aram. And then afterwards, there's a story where also there's this kind of recognition of God's power, and he doesn't let him punish a whole band of people from Aram. And then finally, kind of a reminder, yeah, but there's still an enemy army, and also a revelation of God's power, but one which ends with Israel being transcendent after tremendous tragedy. So it's you could, like, I think maybe we have this progression because we want to end still with remembering Arameans are bad, right? Maybe that's the reason for this order, because the order, it really doesn't make sense, because in the last thing was like, and that was the end of Aram bothering us, and then we go right into Aram doing terrible things to us. So maybe the reason that this story is placed after that is to remind us that no, Aram is really bad, but God's on our side. I find the role of the king in this story actually tremendously touching. The fact that he's there with his people. There's a siege, and he's walking the walls, right? He's walking the walls. He's there. Apparently people are watching him, right? He's walking the walls and looking and seeing what's going on. There's a siege around the walls, and he's walking the walls. This is something that's tremendously distressing to him. And he's there with the people, and a woman can come up to him and say, solve my case. And first he says something sarcastic, and then he's like, okay, what's the problem? He says something sarcastic from the heart. He's like, oh yeah, so how am I going to help you? God's not helping you, so how am I going to help you? Am I going to help you from my tremendous storehouses? How am I going to help you? And then he says, okay, you know what? What's up? And then when she tells the story, he takes it as a tremendous tragedy. It upsets him tremendously, and everyone sees that he's been mourning and torturing himself because of what's going on. And his anger for Elisha, given just a moment, changes to his expression of despair. Why did he want to kill Elisha? Because he doesn't know what to do anymore. He says, if God's against us, what do we have? And Elisha's like, God's not going to be against you anymore. It's all going to end. And one of the things that I kind of like in the story also is when you say, oh, there was this tremendous, what a silly miracle. Oh, there was this tremendous noise and everyone ran away. But anyone who knows anything about the wars of the state of Israel, right, in 48 knows that the Davidka actually helped conquer cities. Just making a big noise sometimes doesn't, right? It's just a big noise and people run away. So it's not actually that crazy, as we know from modern history.
One of the most important battles in the Galil in Nebuchadnezzar was decided when the one Israeli airplane that we had dropped bottles of soda water onto the Arab forces and exploded.
And it's it's actually not that insane. And again, I like the story because you see the king, and you see Elisha at his power, and you see it's a good miracle story. It's a miracle story with a lot of human interest, despite the fact that, of course, and of course that picture of women eating their children is one that's a classic. How low have they sunk story for times of siege and destruction, right? Like we see in Eicha and Lamentations for the destruction of Jerusalem. But the first time we see it in biblical literature is here, right? That the idea that things have gotten so bad that a woman would eat her child, right? Which is unthinkable. and that is what breaks the king. On that happy note, thank you for joining me. We continue with Elisha next week. Still more Elisha to go, but it's interesting stuff. So thanks. I'll see you next week.